Good morning. I'm Chris Bonneau, and I approve this message. I would like to welcome you all to our coffee shop talk on the 2020 presidential election. I'm joined here by three distinguished colleagues who I will introduce to you in a minute. If you have questions or comments, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom webinar, and we will integrate them into the conversation. Please ask whatever questions you want, and we will give you the best answers that we can. Our first panelist received his Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of Pittsburgh back in 1990, and his PhD from the University of Texas. He is the Raymond Dawson Distinguished Bicentennial Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina. His academic research is on trust, polarization, and political behavior. He is co-author of Prius or Pickup: How the Answers to Four Simple Questions Explain America's Great Divide, and Why Washington Won't Work: Polarization, Political Trust, and the Governing Crisis, as well as several others. In case you think all of his research is interesting now, he is also author of Catch-22, Cloture, Energy Policy, and the Limits of Conditional Party Government. Please welcome Marc Hetherington. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's great to be here.
Clarissa Peterson is a native of Steubenville, Ohio, and a professor of political science at DePauw University, where she teaches American politics and Africana studies. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Akron and her PhD from Emory University. Her research explores the electoral behavior of Americans, and more specifically, how race impacts American beliefs and the vote. Professor Peterson's work can be found in the Journal of Black Studies, the Journal of Race and Policy, the National Review of Black Politics, and other places. Her forthcoming book focuses on the relationship between racial resentment and American politics. Clarissa, welcome.
Good to be here.
And our final panelist is somebody who is known probably to some of you, an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. Kanthak received her PhD from the University of Iowa. Her research is on women in politics, political parties, and legislatures. She is the co-author of The Diversity Paradox: Parties, Legislatures, and the Open Foundations, in the Organizational Foundations of Representation in America. She has also published scholarly articles in multiple major journals, including the American Journal of Political Science and the American Political Science Review. She was formerly co-editor of State Politics and Policy Quarterly as well. Kanthak. All right. Thanks all for joining us today. And so I'm going to begin with a couple questions. And again, for those of you who are participating, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and we will weave them in throughout our conversation. So let me start with a question for you, Marc. In Prius or Pickup, you argue that people vote on the basis of their worldviews, rather than a rational evaluation of the candidates' positions on issues. In the context of the 2020 election, what does this mean in terms of the ability of voters to be persuaded by campaigns? And what does this say about undecided voters? And you will have 2 minutes uninterrupted.
All right, feel free to turn off my mic if I go past the 2 minutes. And Clarissa and Chris, feel free to talk over me at any time. So a couple of things that I think are really important here, and that is, when we have a partisanship that's dividing us about things that are kind of deep down inside of us rather than things that we don't know very much about, that's going to mean that our partisanship matters more. So, back, 50 or 60 years ago when the group of us were around the time we were being born, or at least me, our partisanship was kind of determined by how big we wanted the government to be. Did we want it to spend more, tax more, provide more services, fewer services, things along those lines? Since then, as race and feminism, gender roles, sexual orientation, and things like that became the most important issues of the day, what came to divide us was about things that we actually really cared about. How big the government is not one of those things. So as a result, our partisanship was kind of imbued with this, kind of strength and almost anger about the other side. We look at the other side and we think, God, we just don't get those people. And if there's one big, kind of manifestation of that. It's how much we've grown to hate the other side. So, when we think about Republicans, if we're Democrats, we just think there's something wrong with them and vice versa. And in a context like that, Chris, one of the things that we're going to find is that there's not a lot of persuasion that can take place. We look at the other side and think, well, I might not like my side all that much, but the other side's completely unacceptable. So that means that, there won't be a whole lot of persuasion going on during the last days of the campaign. And I'll talk a little bit about this more later. But one of the things that might be an exception to that is the pandemic. When people, when the costs of following people's partisanship is a little bit higher, that might be the time that they can become unrooted from it. And when I talk about the cost of partisanship being higher, the idea that I might get really sick and die, that increases the the cost of your partisanship. So we can return to that in a little while. But bottom line is, Trump's approval ratings through impeachment and a pandemic and an economic surge and an economic decline, they haven't changed. And so as a result, we probably shouldn't expect a whole lot of change in this last week.
That's a great point, Mark. I was listening to the Lincoln Project podcast the other day, and one of the things, I think it was Rick Wilson said on that podcast was, no matter what happens next week, the fact is that 43% of your fellow countrymen are going to think that this guy's okay to be president. And that's just not going to go away with one election. And in fact, that these kind of divides, these kind of baked in things are going to linger for a long time. And so just a one-shot election isn't going to do anything there. Clarissa, you've done a significant amount of research on the topic of race in politics. Obviously, there's a significant amount of social unrest right now, focusing on the treatment of Black citizens by law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Do you think race is a more important issue in this election for Black people compared to the last few elections? What about for white people?
So race has always been important for Black people, but it's important in a way in which we're not typically used to thinking about it. Race is important in the sense that Black people have what we call group consciousness and linked fate. So what we find is that Black people are not individualistic as a group, right? The Black people look at what's happening to Black people as a whole and then decide to make political decisions based on that. That's why it's so difficult for people to explain why such a high percentage of Black people support the Democratic Party. When you see that party as the only party that responds to the needs of your people, so regardless if I'm a millionaire, if this is the only party that is helpful for the people that belong to the group that I belong to, I act in favor of that group and not for my own individualism. Now, for whites, believe it or not, what we're finding is it's been a part of how they voted for a long time, but it's operates in a different way, in the sense that whites were motivated by very overt racist tactics used by politicians, in particular in the South, to try to get their vote, right? And we see the split happening, of course, in the 60s, and one party being embraced as a party in support of changing rights and being progressive on race, and the other party not. But we've seen more recently what we call racial resentment, where racial resentment is being labeled as and being able to explain how whites are participating and the way in which they're participating in the political system. And so racial resentment is increasingly important. Now, this presidency has been pretty interesting because it hints at some return to overt racism, right? So away from this subtle, racial resentment is this subtle racism that guides how people participate in the political system and in the politicians that they choose to support. But we see somewhat of a return to this overt racism, which is somewhat perplexing. But I must also say, yes, we saw a lot of people after the George Floyd murder and other things happen. We've seen a lot of whites begin to understand and say they are sympathetic to systemic racism, but we also see those numbers declining after that. So I am not convinced that those kind of events, as many as we've seen, are going to have the impact where it's actually going to make whites change what their political positions are and were, and who they're supporting, right? If you're supporting, and I think that Marc was just saying this, or Professor Hetherington was just saying this a little while ago, if you're supporting Trump, then seeing all these killings, et cetera, is not going to change your support for Trump, right? It's something they can be sympathetic to, et cetera. Well, some can be sympathetic to, but it's not really going to have the impact where it changes the way whites are actually going to vote this time.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, Clarissa, and I want to follow up just briefly with you here, because right, you see, right, we've had these things before, right, where there's been a lot of attention, then it filters out, whatever else. One of the things I've noticed this time too, and maybe it's just because my kid's older, right? So I've got a 7-year-old, right? And the George Floyd thing like really bothered him, so much so that he like saw some of the protests and he's like, "Mommy, Dad, we have to go protest. We have to go tell people this is not okay." And I've seen that among his peers too, like the amount of people in high school and younger, and Kanthak might be able to speak to this too as the parent of high schoolers in Marc as well. Like it seems like among the younger kids, right, the younger generation, right, there's this sense that this is messed up, right? And these are a lot of kids, right, who, right, the suburbs, right, which are, which apparently are not the monolithic things some people think they are, right? With the kids, they go to school with kids from all different backgrounds and all different races, and the sense that some are being treated unfairly, it seems to resonate, I think, with the younger kids. But obviously they can't vote. But that's but yeah, I think that your thing is very much on point. Let me turn to Kanthak, and also just a reminder, we have 3 questions in the Q&A, and please can you submit them, and we will get to them in a minute here. So Kanthak, the gender gap is defined as the difference between the percentages of women and men who support a given candidate. The Center for American Women in Politics reports that women favor Biden over Trump by about 20 points, which is 9 points higher than it was in 2016, when one of the candidates was in fact a woman. What's going on here?
Well, so there are the way the gender gap works, right? We often talk about like what's the difference between men and women, right? Or why are women different? And one of the things that we saw in 2016 is that it's not that women reacted like really big. There was not a huge level of support for Hillary Clinton because she's a woman, right? But what we saw was a change in men, right? So men's support for Hillary Clinton was like down below where Mike Dukakis's support is, right? And I should preface this by saying, particularly because one of the issues that we're talking about here is race, and the intersectionality of these issues is incredibly important because, when we talk about women voters, that's because it's majority women or majority white women. It tends to be white women's behavior, and there's massive differences between the behavior of white women and women of color. And we saw this a lot, like, Donald Trump sort of kept saying, women voted for me. Well, no, they didn't. Actually, women didn't vote for him. White women, right? A majority of white women voted for Donald Trump in 2016, which is surprising, I think, to a lot of people. But if you have a majority of white women who aren't reacting to gender in a particular way, and you actually have men reacting to gender in a particular way, like if you look at the support for Hillary Clinton was quite low among white men. And now we're kind of fast forwarding, and what we're seeing is a gender gap that is kind of in flux. right? That very early on, what we were seeing is a lot of white women who had supported Donald Trump in 2016 are now moving over to Biden. And to me, that says something more about kind of the reaction that Trump has had, that there were times that Hillary Clinton's gender was not enough to get women to support her because, either straight partisanship and partisanship is a huge motivator, and then there were other reasons as well that we didn't see this massive support for her among women. She's not that popular, and one of the great kind of difficulties for me is that I believe that some, but not all of that is sexism. And I don't know, there's no way to disentangle those things. But what we're seeing as we get closer to election day, what we're seeing is white men are moving toward Joe Biden. And that's why that's sort of one of the changes that we're seeing. So we're seeing the gender gap sort of decline the closer we get to the election. But yeah, the reason that we were seeing these huge gender gaps is that men weren't moving and women were, but now the men are starting to move.
Yeah, that's a good, thanks, it's good. So I saw recently, right, that Biden's favorability, he's like +10, right? But Trump is -15, and Hillary was about the same as Trump. And some of the work that I've done with Kanthak, if you look at feeling thermometers of Hillary and Trump, they were both, right, deeply unpopular. So we have a question here, and I want to start with Marc on this and get other voices as well. Some Democrats think that poor white people are voting against their interest in voting Republican. I recently heard that this may not be true. They are voting that way to uphold white supremacy by voting Republicans, which is their interests. What are your thoughts on this reason? Marc, you're muted.
There you go. The thing that I would say is, first of all, I think it's a really good question. But, I think it's really important to think about why people vote, whether they're rich or whether they're poor, really across the income spectrum. And there's been a lot of talk among people, especially who are liberals, saying, well, those sort of poor whites from rural areas are being duped by the Republicans into voting against their interests. And that gives, sort of an argument that suggests that one's economic interest is the most important interest to a person. And what that argument suggests is that, things like abortion rights, things like, other cultural issues, gun rights, might not be as important to somebody as their economic self-interest is. And I think what we've learned over the course of decades is that's not really the best way to think about it. Somebody's material self-interest, generally speaking, is less important to their vote choice than these sort of symbolic considerations, these symbolic issues, like, God and guns and the environment and things along those lines. So, and I would just sort of suggest, think about the other end of the income distribution. That argument that poor people are being duped into voting against their interests would also suggest that well-off people who are voting for Joe Biden are also being duped into voting against their self-interest. But instead, what a lot of well-off Democrats are thinking is, things like gender equality, same-sex equality, LGBT rights, things along those lines are more important to me than, having lower taxes or something along those lines. So, I think that there are a lot of reasons that people who are lower on the socioeconomic ladder might vote for Republicans. And, maybe in some cases it might have something to do with, racial hierarchy or something like that. But I think that would be a dangerous way of, characterizing all those who are at the bottom of towards the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder voting Republican. It may just be certain things are just more important to them. If abortion rights is something that's really important to you, the fact that there are now 6 Supreme Court justices who are conservative on the court, that's a great victory in that sense. So that would be the way I think I would characterize the sort of voting among low-income whites.
Can I pick up on this too? Because I want to bring it back to something that Dr. Peterson said. And then I'm sorry, I just stepped on. Dr. Peterson, did you want to go first?
That's right. I can go after you.
Okay, good. Then you can tell me if I'm wrong, because I'm gonna put words in your mouth. I think that one of the things that we can highlight here too is what Dr. Peterson was talking about with respect to individualism and collectivism, right? Is that there's this sort of white conception of individualism that there are a lot of white lower class voters, people who don't make very much money, who hear Joe Biden saying, I'm going to raise taxes on people who make over $400,000 a year. And they think, I don't like that idea because someday when I make over $400,000 a year, that's gonna mean me, right? So they're thinking about their prospective economic situation. And you can look at that and say, we know enough to know that if you're currently making 20 grand a year, you're likely never to make 400 grand a year. But that's not something that resonates particularly among poor whites because they have this individualism conception. And this is the same reason why systemic racism is really difficult for them to wrap their heads around, because they live in a world where their individual effort is the only thing that affects their outcomes. So it's very difficult for them to see both that they may, they're likely never, given the way that our world works, they're likely never to make over $400,000 a year. And that's why you see these situations like you did with Jared Kushner yesterday, where he says something that reads to a lot of us as racist, right? As well, Black people need to, Donald Trump can't make Black people work hard. And that reads to me as racist, right? And I'm not saying it's not racist, but what I'm saying is that if you tie it into, it's impossible to disentangle race from the conception of individualism, right? And that's why, these things get really, really complicated, right? So to say sort of, people who agree with what Jared Kushner says are big fat racists, like, you have to not understand how race operates in this country to believe that, but it's not coming specifically from, or it may not be specifically coming from like straight up racism that isn't connected to these other issues. And Clarissa's going to explain it better.
Well, so much to say, but I'm not going to say everything. First is, I agree with absolutely the idea that you have to, for you to believe that, you have to believe the assumption that people are only motivated by their economic interest. And we know that that's not true, right? And I specifically said in the beginning that African Americans are not motivated by their economic interest. It's perhaps the economic interest of the entire community, but certainly not their individual. But I also want to make it clear that race has always been extremely important in this country since the framing of the Constitution, right? So race has never been separate from American politics. Race has always been very much a part of it. And as I teach Africana studies in particular, we're always talking about this idea of what is racism and why is it that when you say someone is a racist, they become so defensive, like you just said, they murdered somebody. The reality is, if you are born, raised, and educated in a country that has been founded on principles that are in line with racist tendencies, right? If you look at the work of Haynes Walton and others, right? So if you are raised, educated, et cetera, socialized in that situation, in that environment, how dare you not be racist? How dare you not be Black and hate your Blackness? So we need to separate all of the value with racism. I assume that everybody is racist until I learned differently. Because everyone who was raised in this environment, and remind you that there's colonization in other countries as well, so they may be as well, right? But you have to do something different to be anti-racist. And in line with that, we have been finding that race has been central to how people vote, and more so in how they evaluate politicians. The way they evaluated Obama's dog, right? The way they evaluate things that have nothing to do with race, and certainly the way they evaluate anything that is overtly race, right? So when you look at Black Lives Matter, one of the things we talk about in an article we just published is about this idea of racial reaction theory, that whenever you hear the word Black in something, for some people, an alarm goes up. I'm getting off topic a little bit, but let me get back on topic for a second, in the sense that race is central to the way that a lot of people think. And it's also the case that those of us who study race and what racism is, et cetera, if you are silent on issues of race, then you might just be considered someone who upholds systemic racism, right? That you can't be silent on issues of race. And the things like what Kushner said, and a lot of the things that Donald Trump has said, et cetera, if you can ignore that, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? Yes, it means other things are important to you, but for some of us, race means life or death.
So if I could just toss one thought in, because I think it follows nicely onto this. You know, the work that I've done is about, these sort of competing worldviews. Whether we ought to, what's the best way to think about it? Stick with the things that have been traditional and the way things have always been, as opposed to challenging, those traditions. And, probably the most important central element of, that worldview divide as it relates to politics is race. That's what started this sort of worldview evolution back in the 60s and started to divide the parties up in different ways. And I think the key thing, to keep in mind about that, and you can see it in the answers to the questions, and you see it, played out on our television screens, and that is, we really have passionate feelings about that. And that's one of the reasons that the worldview divide, a worldview politics, creates such polarization. And makes it difficult to find middle ground. People on opposite sides, as both Clarissa and Chris were pointing to, we don't really understand why the others, see it the way that they see it. This thing about Jared Kushner, I think, is a perfect example of it. People on the left side of the worldview divide can't help but think, God, what a racist. And people on the other side are like, well, that's just how it is. So anyway, I just wanted to tie that back to one of the points I was making a little earlier. Race is just, it's an issue that throughout the course of history has just been one that's always created these kinds of reactions.
It's
Maybe
interesting.
one little quick snip on this, because I think this is really important, and I think what Marc said is exactly right. Right, the way that systemic racism operates is that Jared Kushner says what he says, right, and if you point out that it's racist, then you're the jerk, right? And in fact, white people are kind of like in this compact where we are expected to give other white people a pass, right? If there is a way for me to explain what you have done in a way that makes you not racist, I not only can do it, but I am obliged to do it. And if I don't do it, I'm rude, right? And I think so that's how this sort of plays out. And it's not, I think where there's an important distinction here, because Tony, he's another guy. Tony Kushner's fine. Jared Kushner didn't sit down and say, how can I say something racist today, right? He just, and this is why Dr. Peterson's point is so important, right? He just didn't sit down and say, how can I be anti-racist today, right? And that's how this sort of operates, is that he believes that he's not going out to, like, he hasn't decided, I'm going to show up and be racist today. And I think that's why some of Donald Trump's appeals have worked really well, because because they're not like kind of the traditional Southern strategy that we're seeing from the Republican Party, where they're intentionally using race to kind of draw people in, but it's because that's how the mindset is, right? And it just operates that way. And I'm rude if I point it out. Sorry, Bonneau, go ahead.
No, it reminds me of when Clarissa's talking about the issue of voting interests, right? The old Charles Barkley quote, right? At first, Charles Barkley was Republican, and his mom would say, "Charles, why are you Republican? They're for rich people." It's like, "Well, Mom, I'm rich." Well, Charles Barkley isn't a Republican anymore, right? And there's a reason for that, right? And that has to do with the lived experiences, right, and the shared group experiences that you see from that like Clarissa talked about. I want to shift a little bit, but I want to stay on this racism, sexism thing. We got a couple of questions here about the vice president. So one is with the idea of sexism, and I would ask racism, do you think it will carry over to Kamala Harris? And then we also have a question specifically for Dr. Peterson, right? What are Indiana's today's view on Vice President Pence? And so I don't know, whoever wants to start, Chris or Clarissa, and talk about maybe the role of the vice president in this whole thing, perceptions of Pence, kind of the attacks on Kamala Harris, and how that all is working in the context of what we just talked about.
I'll just start only because the Indiana connection, which I guess I'm in Indiana. Indiana. The funny thing about Pence, most people know this probably, is that his career was over. He wasn't going to be reelected as the governor of Indiana. Trump saw that he was having problems with evangelicals, so he said, I'll get him, right? He's a legit Republican. And so he got Pence, and it's been a success story. So Pence's career was rejuvenated thanks to Donald Trump. Indiana is solid Trump territory. As we think about the election, et cetera, one of the ways in which I knew that Hillary Clinton was going to lose before she left is communities in Indiana, the rural communities in the area where I live, the lines were extremely long during early voting and also, on the actual vote date. And that to me meant, that means that people are especially motivated to vote in support of Trump, because I knew that Indiana was pro-Trump. So I don't think that people care much about Pence being on the ticket. I think that it solved the problem that it was meant to solve, which is to legitimize Donald Trump as a Republican. And I think it did just that. Now, on the other side, in terms of Kamala Harris, it's been interesting because I think he appointed her partially to solidify not the Black vote, but to motivate Black people to vote. Because many will argue, and I think that we all realize, it's not really the undecideds that's the real story. The real story is about who's going to turn out, right? That's who's going to win. So when they're telling us in all these news broadcasts, hey, these are the undecideds and this is what they're thinking, that just goes out the window for me. It's about who's going to be motivated to show up and turn up, as we say. And so Kamala Harris, in some ways, does motivate the biggest block in the Black community, Black women. And so Black women are more motivated to make sure they turn out. But also, there's a lot of patriarchy going on within the Black community as well. So we see Black men in record numbers supporting Donald Trump. Now, record numbers doesn't mean 40% of Black men, but I mean, they're inching up toward 20% perhaps, enough so that we are saying, hey, we need to do some research on this and figure out what's going on. And so Kamala Harris being a woman, but also her history with criminal justice in California, and they just won't let her shake that no matter how long ago it was. So those kind of things are hurting her when it comes to Black men, and may not make them vote for Trump, but Black people vote for Trump, but may make people not show up to support the Biden-Harris ticket.
So are you, So basically, with the black men in that situation, it's like a hyper form of sexism, right? That they're more sexist than they are, so they're more concerned, I guess, with the sexist aspect than having an African American in that position.
Well, I think it's sexism, but it's also couple that with the criminal justice stuff. So they can't reconcile first the criminal justice, or I don't know which is first or second, but they can't reconcile the criminal justice history, mass incarceration, and a Black woman. Now, they wouldn't say, of course, that they don't support a Black woman, but we know patriarchy rears its ugly head in a number of ways, including the way in which people evaluated Hillary Clinton, even if they don't recognize it.
Yeah, and can I jump on this quickly, because I just saw there's one outlier poll out there about Pennsylvania that actually has Trump up by 3. And one of the big assumptions that is going into this poll is that there's this silent African American male Trump vote that nobody else is picking up. That they are going to vote for Trump and they're not saying it. And I sort of dismissed that poll until like 30 seconds ago when Dr. Peterson used the same number, this 20%, that 20% of African-American men could vote for Trump. And that's sort of their assumption. And so I think what it really points out is that these things are just plain incredibly complicated. And when we see someone like Kamala Harris, there's the intersection of race and gender and running for office is difficult and complicated, right? And so one of the difficulties that Hillary Clinton had is that there's this conception of femininity that's tied into white femininity that is about being demure and sweet and not too shrill, and then a conception of leader, and those things don't match, right? But one of the things that we know, and this is part of systemic racism, is that it's tied in with this idea that white men have to protect white women from dangerous Black men, right? And so that's where a lot of this comes from. And then you're like, who does this leave out? It leaves out Black women, right? So white women are don't really have any agency and need to be cared for, and white men are these powerful saviors, and Black men are scary and dangerous. And then and Black women are this kind of confusing thing that that systemic racism kind of doesn't know what to do with Black women. And what you get is kind of this combination of scary and incompetent in this sort of, and so it's kind of this double-edged sword that that Kamala Harris has sort of going against her, and we saw that in the most recent debate. And one of the things that we're not talking enough about is the amount of time and energy that Kamala Harris puts into handling those issues. So when she said, "I'm speaking," for example, right, that was very powerful. But the reason is that there just aren't that many options. Like, she cannot go ham on Mike Pence, right? That's not an option that's open to her. And she also can't just be this sweet little demure thing. And so I think one of the ways that she's very successful, and this is not by chance, right? She has worked very hard on this, is trying to thread that needle as a woman of color who is dealing with these kind of expectations that are coming from all over the place.
Great.
I wonder if I could speak just real quickly to the African-American male issue, because, I think this is really interesting to watch. And I think, I don't exactly know what the core of it is, but, I think Clarissa is really speaking to something super important in this apparent, widening gender divide among African-Americans. And, I think it's right to say, we're not going to see more than, say, 20% of African-American men voting for Donald Trump. But, you see the treatment of African-American interests in the Trump administration as it relates to, George Floyd and white supremacy. And you think, how can that possibly be? And I've actually been, kind of thinking about this. So part of this is going to be anecdote, and then part of it's going to be research. So literally 4 years ago, I was getting ready to get on a plane and fly to Berlin. And so this was on the day before the election. And as was commonly the case, I was running late because, professors are always late. So I had to go to the valet to park my car rather than to park in the parking lot and go in. And there were two African-American men who were manning the valet station. And, we started to chat a little bit, and they asked where I was going. I said, I was going to Germany, and they were interested about what, and I was talking about the election. And, the two guys were like, oh, so, you're into politics. And I said, yeah, I'm a professor. And he said, well, who are you voting for? And the other guy said, I know who you're voting for. You're voting for Hillary. And I said, well, how do you know that? And he said, because you're soft. He just looked at me and he was just like, you're soft. I can just tell. And, there's this sort of thing, that stuck with me, in a way. And, the fact is, I think there's a sense in African-American male community that the world is hard. It's tough. And, you got to be, whatever. So anyway, we've been working on, ways of trying to get people to reveal how tough they think the world is, that you have to sometimes be ruthless. That's one of the questions that we ask. You got to play to win. Fighters are the people who, survive in this. I mean, just commonly held, sort of views of things. And what we find is not that many people have that, sort of really competitive, worldview. But among African Americans who do, they love Donald Trump. Among whites who do, they love Donald Trump too. But this sort of like hyper competitive, almost, you got to do whatever it takes to win type of view of things. It's not common, in the country, but to the extent that it exists, it really seems to be this new dimension, and certainly understanding Donald Trump specifically. And, at least according to the models that we've been working on, it seems to have an especially large effect among African-American people in particular.
Yeah, so Marc, it's interesting, right? Poor Marc is soft, but Marc violated rule number 1 of being a political scientist, which is you never tell a stranger what you do, ever. It doesn't end well. It never does. All right, so we have a couple of questions here on the Supreme Court from Kelly. What happens if the court strikes down Obamacare? And then also what just happened to the Supreme Court, what the future looks like. So I'll start with this one since in my, when I'm not co-hosting Coffee Talk, I actually study this stuff a little bit. The Supreme Court has always been political. It's always been politicized. So I think this notion that that this is something new is not true. I mean, elections have consequences. The big problem is life tenure, right? Nobody should have life tenure except, of course, for professors. And when you have a life tenure seat, it increases the stakes of every nominee, right? And so you're going to get nominees who are younger, who are going to be there for a longer period of time. And it really skews the balance, right? The Republicans have 6 seats or 6 nominees on the Supreme Court. They won the popular vote once in the past 30 years. Now it's 2004. So what's up with that, right? And it has to do with our institutional systems. As for Obamacare, I think this is a big issue that 60 Minutes tried to get at with the president and Joe Biden did too, but I think that they failed to land. If the Supreme Court strikes down, right, the part of Obamacare, right, then it's no longer law, right? It's no longer law when that decision is made. So what does that mean? Well, what that means then is if there's no plan in place to replace it, then there's going to be a gap for individuals. And so how is that going to work? and there really hasn't been anything. So, I mean, the stakes at the Supreme Court are high, as they are with any election. And for anyone who's surprised that the Republicans, voted on Barrett so quickly, or that, I mean, you shouldn't be, right? This is politics. This is why, why winning matters, why having control of the seats of government matters, and why if you have one side that's willing to change the rules to get outcomes and the other side that's not, you're unilaterally disarming. So in terms of packing the court, right? First of all, I mean, it's unclear what it means to pack the court. To increase seats is not necessarily packing the court, although it is increasing seats. 9 has been the number since 1869. It's not in the Constitution. We've had as few as 6. We've had as many as 10. That, might be something worth considering, or going to, term limits, right? A single non-renewable term. That would require a constitutional amendment. I mean, I think everything's on the table. There's been a lot of dissatisfaction with life tenure for Supreme Court judges for a long time. Right? This has been discussed by law professors for at least 25, 30 years. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything about the court before we turn to the police.
Just a quick thing about Obamacare. There's actually an easy fix to this, even if it gets thrown out by the Supreme Court, because the case that's before the Supreme Court is essentially saying that because Congress put the penalty for not having an insurance at 0, that essentially takes away the individual mandate, and so all of Obamacare falls down, which was the goal when the Republicans set it at 0. The second you set it at something other than 0, that problem goes away, right? So you could imagine a situation where if Democrats got into power, they would set that number at something else. And given the amount of time that it often takes for the Supreme Court to make a decision, there may not be a decision that comes down on that case before January 20th. So you could imagine a situation where Obamacare in the decision that we're looking at loses, but it ends up not really mattering. The Republicans could also come in and add that number in. And it's from a political science perspective, it's a really interesting question as to what the Republicans would do if Obamacare got thrown out, because it would take out the individual mandate, or it would take out the pre-existing conditions and all this stuff that is really popular. But it can be fixed legislatively in a couple lines. A couple lines in legislative talk, which is a couple hundred lines. But it's an easy fix if someone wants to fix it.
Right, and we all know that things can move quickly if they want them to move quickly. I want to get to one last question here before we get to predictions. I didn't tell you we were going to do predictions, but we're going to do predictions because they're fun. And that way we can play this recording back afterwards when we're all wrong. So, Dr. Peterson, will you please speak to the issue of defunding the police? Listening to many voters, the defunding of the policemen was a huge reason why many are still choosing to vote for Trump. What are the advantages, disadvantages of securing our communities with more resources other than only having a police department?
First off, I don't think that defunding the police has made anyone vote for or against Biden. Right? People already were going to vote a certain way, and this is just the explanation they use for how they were going to vote. Again, it may, for those who were not very strong supporters, it might make them say, see, this is why I can't see myself going out there in this cold weather to stand in line to support somebody who does this. So I don't think that defunding the police is that big issue bomb that we come to think it is. I also think, though, that defunding the police is a victim of its own name. That because they say defunding the police, instead of something like changing the way in which we give resources to police departments, or dealing with the symptom, or dealing with the real issues instead of the symptoms, or something like that, focusing on what gets people arrested, right? Dealing with those things in the communities, or community policing even, that would have had a more positive response from people. But because you say defunding the police, people will think, and again, already having in mind what they're going to do. So they already have their thoughts about things like Black Lives Matter. And they will say, oh, that means they're not going to give them any money. Wow. How are we going to have law and order when we don't give the police any money? Well, that's not really what it's saying. And that campaign, for example, in Indiana is huge. Every candidate who is a Democrat, anytime you look at their television commercials, campaigns, et cetera, they are associating them with defunding the police, because we all know that Indiana is pretty conservative, it's Trump territory, et cetera. So if nothing else, they're trying to persuade, I would argue, they're trying to persuade people, if you vote for Biden, it's a vote for defunding the police, and therefore, at the least, stay home.
It's a really interesting rhetorical strategy that the Trump campaign's using, right? Blaming Biden for the 1994 crime bill, which locked up so many people, while at the same time saying that he's against law and order, and that if he gets in there, AOC +3 or whatever the nomenclature is will lead to the Antifa in the suburbs, and then showing video clips of things that are actually happening right now when he's president. So it really, I mean, the mental gymnastics, it's impressive.
Can I?
Go ahead. Yes, please.
I just wanted to add, the one thing that I want to make sure I say before I leave is that race is not logical, or racism doesn't make you act in a logical way. And so when we see people like Donald Trump doing the things that he does, saying the things that he says, and we sit back like, now wait, what the heck? How does that happen? Like what you just mentioned, it doesn't make sense, and it'll never make sense to rational people, because for us, things have to make sense. But racism is so entrenched that people are willing, and think about our history, people were willing to let their businesses go under than to sell to Black people, or than to hire Black people. And, it just doesn't make sense. We sat there and watched the country basically torn down because racism. It's just not logical. So you, my friend, are trying to make logic of something that's illogical.
Yeah, no, I spend a lot of time trying to make sense of things that don't make sense. It's right. So let's finish up with some predictions, and we'll go around here about predictions, not just for the presidential race, but also the Senate and the House, as well as any other things you think we should be watching, or things we should be looking for next week. So we'll go in the same order, and we'll start with Marc.
Well, this is always dangerous business. When it's time to make predictions, and that same trip that I was on in 2016, just before it, I was in England and was giving this talk in front of a foreign affairs audience, and somebody asked me about the presidential election, and it was the exact week that the Access Hollywood tape had hit. And, my sense was it was going to be a big Democratic victory, that week. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. But, it just feels to me like the fundamentals of the situation seem to suggest that the Democrats will win relatively big on November 3rd. The polls are, on average showing about a 10-point gap in favor of Biden. Just to put that into some perspective, the last time an incumbent presidential candidate lost by that amount, it was Jimmy Carter in 1980. This is a huge margin by any account. And my sense is the polls probably have taken into account the mistakes that were made last time in underestimating the number of white working class voters that were coming out. And I think that there's every reason to believe that we'll actually see more young voters coming out to vote in this election cycle than is probably being assumed in the polls. And the young people are, on average, Democrats. So I think there's a lot of reason to think this will be a relatively big election for Democrats. When, something along those lines happens, usually you end up winning some seats that you don't expect. So to go back to that 1980 election, a number of, lions of the Senate, longtime Democratic members who were super important people, were swept out of office by the Republican landslide in 1980. And I won't be surprised if we see, a couple of those things happening, here this year. You might see the Democrats even winning a seat like in a state like Kansas, or a state like Alaska. Certainly, a state like Montana is very much on the watch list already. So, my sense is, this is again likely to be a pretty good Democratic year. But again, I say that fully acknowledging the fact that I said that in 2016 too, and that didn't turn out to be correct. So anyway, we'll find out in a week. And I think the one thing that I might need sometime during this week to borrow from my friend Jonathan Weiler is to be put into a medically induced coma for the last week of the campaign, just so that I don't have to watch the shenanigans that take place. If somebody could wake me up on November 5th, I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, and to be fair, right, to Mark, and to remind everybody, right, Hillary Clinton did win 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, and Donald Trump won the election by 77,000 votes over 3 states. Right, so this whole notion that everyone's vote counts the same is belied by that fact. And Mark, after years living in Tennessee, which is not a swing state, is getting some swing state action, which those of us who have lived in a swing state in every election since 2000 can tell you it's awful, and you should be.
It's a mixed blessing. Oh my gosh. I've been watching the baseball, all the time. So I get about 84 ads a day. It's not great, Chris.
No, well, at least Trump is broke. So you're not getting as many as you would if they were all the ads, right? Clarissa, predictions.
I guess I would predict that Biden-Harris win depending on voter suppression. So it depends on how rampant voter suppression is, and even including our ability to count votes after the fact, right? That if everything is legit, then I think that Biden-Harris will win. I also think that just like Republicans are counting on Democrats not being motivated by bringing up the things like defunding the police, et cetera. So if nothing else, Democrats can't pull themselves to vote for Biden because of all these things that went wrong and all these things that he says that are just not in line with their ideals. I think that actually is working against Trump in terms of there are some people who are Republican who would love to support the Republican ticket, but they just can't pull themselves to vote for somebody who has let so many people die with the pandemic, somebody who has said the things racially that he said. So I think that he actually overplayed his hand about a lot of things. And even with the pandemic, right? If he had just let us feel sorry for him when he got the disease, he could have actually turned this into a positive for him. But instead of letting us feel sorry for him, he had to come out and say all this stuff after the fact. So I think that he keeps overplaying his hand and people won't be able to pull themselves to vote for him.
All right, Kanthak, quickly, predictions.
I totally agree with all of them. Here's my fun little prediction. Commerce Secretary Tom Wolf.
Oh, interesting. So I'll give you my quick ones as we're on our way out. I also agree. I think the Democrats will take control of the Senate. I think you can say goodbye to Joni Ernst and Susan Collins, Tom Tillis, Cory Gardner, obviously. And my fun little one, right? Doug Jones hangs on in Alabama. That's my fun little one. Look, if we're in playing Georgia, Doug Jones in Alabama, I have a feeling Doug Jones squeaks it out in Alabama. So that's my little fun one. I want to thank the panelists, Marc Hetherington, Clarissa Peterson, and Chris Kanthak for taking the time and spending the past hour with us. I want to thank all of you who attended for your excellent questions. You haven't voted yet, please vote next Tuesday, November 3rd. You may have to wait in line, pack a sandwich, mask up for safety, and yeah. So thank you all. After the election, hopefully we'll be back for a recap. And my other fun little prediction, I'll leave you with this, is that we will know the winner on election night after Florida is called at 11 p.m. for Biden-Harris. So with that, thank you all and have a good night.